Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by a grant from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education for bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. degrees. New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH. And by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Michael Ratner. Thank you for joining us.
Lorene, it's really good to be here in Santa Fe. I've enjoyed my day already.
Oh, good. Well, you're here as a guest of the Landon Foundation as part of their series In Pursuit of Cultural Freedom. And more than almost anyone, you embody cultural freedom. You are a human rights activist and attorney. You're the director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. And you've written many, many, many books. You're here to speak about Guantanamo and the erosion of civil rights in America since 9/11. So I just wanted to show a couple of your books. This one is really a godsend. This one's called Hell No, Your Right to Dissent in 21st Century America. This is a handbook that people really need. And one of your other recent books, there are many, but I just have this one, The Trial of Donald Rumsfeld, a prosecution by book. Very interesting stuff. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me again, Lorene.
In your legal career, you represented a group of Guantanamo detainees at the Supreme Court in 2004. And what was the result?
Well, we won in 2004. And the issue there is whether the president has the authority to pick people up anywhere in the world and put them, in this case, Guantanamo, an offshore U.S. prison camp, and never let them go to court to see why they're there. And the Supreme Court said in 2004, and they had to repeat it in 2006 and 7 and 9, 3 times they had to repeat it, that you have the right to go to court, these Guantanamo detainees. And so that was a major victory. We've been able to get Guantanamo's population down from around 700 who went through the camp down to around 200 now. But of course now we're in a very stuck place. Obama, who had promised to close Guantanamo, issued an executive order saying he would do that in a year, has failed to do so, and now sadly it looks like this offshore prison camp with some 171 people is a permanent fixture of our American landscape. It's very, very sad for me. When we took on these cases right after 9/11. I had actually lived in New York. I saw what happened at the World Trade Center. I was down there at the time. And it was devastating, but at the same time, the reaction of the United States, particularly the Bush administration, was devastating. And we decided we had to go to court to protect people's fundamental rights, even if we fundamentally disagreed with their politics or social ideas or whatever. We just felt that protecting fundamental democratic rights in this country was essential.
Well, one of the things about this book, Hell Now, is that you trace the erosions of civil liberties or civil rights from, you start with the Sedition Act of what, 17?
Well, early.
You go early, you go all the way through right. With the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Espionage Act, you trace all of that. And then, after 9/11, there have been some frightening erosions of our rights, and you detail those. What the value in a book like this, which is really a handbook about dissent and what your rights are, is that people no longer have civics, so they don't remember what basic rights are protected by the Constitution, and with the change in the laws since 9/11, people really need to know where we stand. So could you briefly outline some of the changes that you find most remarkable since 9/11 in terms of our human rights?
You know, Lorene, I've actually lived through a lot of this. I mean, in 1976, that was the end of the Vietnam War, we actually had a tremendous outpouring of people saying we should have a right to protest, a right to go to the streets to change our government. And it was a period really of where the FBI was caught in all its spying, the CIA was, and there was a pushback against the FBI and the CIA. And since from 76 really until today, we've seen a gradual, accelerated after 9/11, erosion of what I would say is the fundamental right to dissent in this country. And it's serious, it's extremely serious to me, because if I look at how social change is made, social change, yeah, sure, it's helpful I can go to court and sit behind the computer and type briefs and argue cases. but it's made by people hitting the streets, protesting, petitioning their government for change, and having the ability to do that. We've seen that across the Middle East. We've seen it in Wisconsin. We've seen it with immigrant rights demonstrations. That's the way social change is made. Unfortunately, after 9/11, that form of social change, what I would call the right to freely dissent, the right to petition your government for change, which is the right to protest,
the right to assemble peaceably.
The right to assemble peaceably.
A peaceful demonstration.
Right. Those three things: peacefully dissenting, just speaking your mind, assembling, and protesting, and petitioning.
Yeah.
Those are absolutely fundamental, and they all are embodied in our Constitution, in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Most people don't know that. Most people think of the right to dissent as the right of you or myself to stand on a soapbox outside a building and say, here's what I think. That's not what it's about. It's the right to gather together politically with other people, stage protests, as well as then petition the government for fundamental change. And what's really been hurt post 9/11 are those rights. And it's been hurt in a number of different ways. Of course, you can look at the book to find out, but the Patriot Act being one, the Patriot Act which allows the government deep ways of surveilling everything we do, which allows the government to declare certain kinds of protest as forms of terrorism. The Patriot Act is certainly one of the building blocks of the suppression of dissent, but then it's also been the idea that when people gather to protest, that protest is somehow going to relate to terrorism or something like that, and that's serious.
Well, that's the switcheroo that's been pulled. We've gone from honoring whistleblowers and their long history of bringing about very important change to now making them terrorists, labeling them as terrorists. And in some of the cases, like the telecom eavesdropping on Americans, a whistleblower came forth and did the telecoms get punished for violating our civil rights? No, the whistleblower got punished. And look at this man, Thomas Drake. Again, 60 Minutes has done a piece on it, Jane Meyer in the New Yorker. He is simply upholding the Constitution, and he is now in danger of not only losing his job, but his freedom for speaking out in favor of our rights.
I think the figure that Jane Meyer gives in her New Yorker article is that the Obama administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers than prior administrations put together. I mean, that's extraordinary. So you have a guy like Drake who exposes all kinds of bad stuff going on at the National Security Agency, and he gets prosecuted. You have a guy, like you said, who exposed the fact that all the telecom companies were putting special machinery, illegally, on our telephone and internet lines and picking up every single internet and telephone communication. And what happens? We sue them. My office, the Center for Constitutional Rights, sues them. The ACLU sues them. We all sue them. And what happens is Congress passes a bill saying they're immune from suit. You cannot sue the telecoms. They were doing it at the request of President Bush. You can't sue them. And the person who exposed it gets prosecuted. So we have an incredible situation, and the secrecy is all part of it. And Obama came into office promising transparency. I'm glad you used that word, transparency. And what have we gotten? We've gotten a security secrecy blanket over everything. So every lawsuit that we at the center bring, the ones that the ACLU has brought, trying to challenge torture, trying to challenge the rendition program of taking people abroad to be tortured, they throw over the blanket of secrecy. You can't bring the lawsuit because it's secret. Then they prosecute the leakers. And then you think about WikiLeaks. If you ask yourself, why do we need WikiLeaks? Well, you and I have just really explained why. Yeah. Because they don't allow any of this stuff to come out. Any stuff that really, to be a democracy, knowledge is what a democracy is about. It's so you can make an intelligent vote. And democracy dies when the information is secret. It dies behind closed doors. And so WikiLeaks has played a role that it shouldn't have even had to play. I mean, we should have been able to hear about torture outside of WikiLeaks.
And look what they've done to Bradley Manning and what they're trying to do to Julian Assange. I mean, Bradley Manning, you're talking about this is by anyone's definition torture. The solitary confinement, the sleeping naked, the know even who did who went to go see him? Kucinich tried to see him in jail.
They wouldn't let Kucinich.
They wouldn't
see him.
let a sitting.
I don't think Daniel Ellsberg's got to see him either. No.
No. So here are some people of impeccable credentials, and they're not allowed in.
It's a 21 or 22-year-old kid who was forced to sleep basically naked on a cement floor in an underground, you'd have to say a tomb practically.
Yeah.
And here's someone who, as Ellsberg said, he is essentially the Daniel Ellsberg of our generation. And Ellsberg points this out, Ellsberg leaked documents that were top secret. And Ellsberg wound up, of course, not going to jail. Of course, Nixon tried to prosecute him. He never did.
And we're talking about the Pentagon Papers.
Right, the Pentagon
Daniel
Papers.
Ellsberg.
Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. Bradley Manning leaked documents that were secret, not even top secret. And here it's a year after. This is roughly the anniversary of the year that we're speaking of the first leaks of the videotape regarding the firing on the Reuters journalists that the U.S. for some reason was keeping secret. I mean, whatever happened to those Reuters journalists, the idea that 2 journalists were killed from the air by a helicopter and the U.S. refused to expose that information is incredible to me. Who are they hiding it from? I mean, what's going on here? They're hiding it from the American people? What are they doing? There's nothing secret about that at all. But Bradley Manning is a very, very terrible case, and of course their efforts to link Julian Assange to that case makes no sense. They're trying to distinguish him from the work you do as a journalist or the New York Times does as a journalist.
The New York Times publish it just like Julian Assange publishes information.
How do they explain it? How do they explain
it? Well, they
it?
have an unusual way of thinking. They do.
Right.
Speaking of unusual ways of thinking, when Obama came into office, he did not prosecute any of the former administration, the previous administration, for torture, for war criminals, for any of these things that some people felt they should, saying, no, we're not going to look to the past, we're moving forward. But you point out, and I'd like you to address this, that when you bring people to justice and you operate under the rule of law, you're actually looking to the future. You're establishing precedent, and they were not actually looking to the past. You are looking to establish, what's right and what's wrong. So talk to me about your work.
I mean, I thought Obama's statement when he took office that we're not going to prosecute any of the torturers. And what's interesting is those people were open and notorious torturers. This is not a mistake of some low-level soldiers. This was Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, essentially saying we tortured and we would do it again. And in the face of that, Obama says we're not going to look at their conduct. We're going to look forward and not backward. And yes, it's exactly that. How do you have a forward without torture, where torture will not be practiced again unless you go backwards and prosecute the people who tortured? Because if you don't do that, then when the next, quote, emergency happens, torture will be brought out and used again. So I found it to be utterly disingenuous by Obama, and really one of the worst decisions he made was to essentially give the torture America, the torturers in chief, from Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, the whole lot of them, give them a free pass on torture. Because what it says is it wasn't illegal, and what it does is it makes it a political football. The next time, and it happened just now, when bin Laden is found, you have all of the pro-torture people coming out of the woodwork saying, see, torture worked.
And yet, absolutely not. There's no evidence at all.
There's no evidence.
Torture 11 years ago led to the location in...
No evidence at all. And in addition, what's terrible about it is because Obama didn't bring anyone to justice for it, it makes torture into a political issue and not a legal and moral issue. Mm-hmm. So it makes it into one in which we can argue about it. Oh, maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, maybe we should use it, maybe we shouldn't. If someone's prosecuted and if convictions are had, it's understood you don't go off the page and torture people.
Well, not only is it more, as you say, a moral issue, but in terms of our own troops. Because if it's okay for us to torture them, then when they capture our troops, it's okay, turnabout is fair play, for them to torture our people. So if anything else, to protect our own people, we should, absolutely draw the line. Torture will not be allowed or tolerated. Now, tell me about Spain and Switzerland and how you've been working with them since America, the United States, has not chosen to prosecute the torturers. Other countries who are all signers, as we are, to these torture statutes, anti-torture statutes. What's happening with Spain and Switzerland?
Well, actually, it's a pretty exciting result. I mean, I'd be more excited if we had some prosecutions going on here of the torturers in the United States. But failing that, you are allowed to go to other countries to bring torture prosecutions. And other countries have laws that allow individuals to go into court and try and push the prosecuting judge into doing prosecutions. And torture is one of the few. There's a handful of crimes that can be prosecuted anywhere in the world. A torturer is considered an enemy of all humankind, much like a pirate was 150 years ago. And that allows national courts in different countries, to bring prosecutions against torturers, particularly if any of their citizens or residents were tortured by the people you're trying to sue. So we've tried a number of different ways to do that in Europe. The two most successful so far, one was Switzerland. We had heard that former President Bush was about to make his first trip out of the United States to Switzerland. Invited to Switzerland to give a speech. We decided to prepare a torture prosecution to present in the courts of Switzerland. Bush had just admitted in his book that he ordered waterboarding, a form of torture, and would do it again. And so we decided, let's go to Switzerland. We prepared the complaint. Bush got wind of it about 2 days before because it became public. We had to file it. And he then refused to go to Switzerland. He canceled the trip, which not only meant he probably canceled the huge honorarium, but it also, if you think about it from our point of view, justice is very slow in these areas. It took 30 years to finally get Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, prosecuted. There's still Argentinian trials going on from the 70s. So we have a long view of this. But if we look at what happened in Switzerland, the idea that the former president of the most powerful country in the world cannot travel, couldn't travel to Switzerland, and probably cannot travel to the 147 other countries that have signed the Convention Against Torture, is a great victory. So that's one. Spain is even more exciting. Spain, we actually have opened a prosecution of torture as it was used at Guantanamo and in the United States. And they're looking, or by the United States, and they're looking up the chain of command in Spain. They've opened the cases. 3 or 4 people have already testified in the Spanish cases. For all we know, we don't know this yet, warrants may have already been issued within the European community. If any of the torturers come into that community, they may well get arrested. So if you're someone like Rumsfeld or Bush or Cheney, I would not be planning my next visit to the Prado. I'll put it that way, the art museum in Spain.
Well, you did a whole book, The Trial of Donald Rumsfeld. Since it's not going to actually go to court and have a trial in court, you present the entire case in this very well-written book.
Right. Well, I did that in part because we knew that the United States was never going to prosecute Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was a key actor in the Guantanamo tortures. In fact, they're called the Rumsfeld techniques. My first clients at Guantanamo I met when they were released. There were 4 English guys, and they told me a story. This is before Abu Ghraib, before we knew anything. A story of what happened to them, of stripping, of hooding, of sexual humiliation, of dogs, of a whole series of step-by-step tortures. And I was skeptical. I said, look, they're in Guantanamo. This is the United States. And then it comes out that these are actually techniques that Rumsfeld himself signed off on, and without even batting an eye, essentially. And he was never going to be prosecuted. So in the book, we outline what a prosecution of Rumsfeld would look like, what an opening statement would look like, and what his defense would look like. And there isn't much defense. There isn't really any.
Yeah. You have gotten so many awards, the Courage of Conviction Award and the Puffin Nation Prize for Creative Citizenship, even the John Lennon Yoko Ono Peace Prize. You have a radio show called Law and Disorder, and you also have a blog called Just Left on your website, michaelratner.com. So you're working on many, many levels with this, but what I'm wondering is, how did you come to this in the first place? How did human rights, how did that end up being your passion?
Well, we started off, we have different names for lawyers like me. We started as what you would have called radical lawyers, then we became civil rights lawyers, then we became, as international human rights became so important, human rights lawyers. But the quick answer is I was at Columbia Law School in 1968. And Columbia Law School in 1968 was where really the university was taken over in 1968 by the students protesting the Vietnam War, the building of a gymnasium that was going to admit the African American community through a separate entrance, and war research going on at Columbia. So there was a huge protest. I got very involved in it. It was the time of the Civil Rights era, and once the cops were sent on campus and I was there, and the cops, picked me up and beat me, that was really the end. I mean, I think an administration doesn't realize when they send really heavy thug-like cops onto a campus and beat the heck out of people, that those people's lives are changed forever. And you don't really look back. And I never looked back after that. I just decided I was at a law school. I could have gone into a career in Wall Street, into a big firm, and I decided absolutely not, that what was going on in the war, what was going on in civil rights, was too important, and that I had to stay with it.
Well, what happens, because I also am a child of the 60s, is that you get the normal middle-class kid who thinks this can't happen here, and suddenly, individual by individual, it does happen to them, and they're stripped of all their rights, and they're thinking, wow, if this happens to me, and then they start looking around, this is happening to lots and lots of people. And that's what I really appreciate about the book, Hell No, Your Guide to Dissent, because people have sort of forgotten what you can do and what you can't do. You describe what, if there's a knock at the door, what are the laws about search warrants, about surveillance? What is it that Eliot Spitzer said about the older forms of communication? Don't write when you can talk,
right.
And don't email anything, because that's forever. But not that we have anything to hide. You always think, well, I've got nothing to hide. I don't care if they search me, but you have to stand up for your individual rights, and that's what you've done.
I hesitate to say it. I mean, partly because of the digitizing of information, partly because of 9/11, that there isn't a lot of privacy left. And the laws embolden them to do it. So the FBI, to investigate you or I or anybody, no longer needs to believe that there was any criminal aspect to any of our behavior. They can just do it, which means they can go into every mosque, synagogue, or church in the country. They can go into every political organization in the country. They can infiltrate someone into that organization, and there's no boundaries. And that's a very bad situation, because it makes it very hard to organize when your so-called best friend may not really be your best friend, and when all your information is looked at. I just think it has to be understood that you have to organize under those conditions, but it's really unfortunate.
Well, people do have the right to peaceably assemble, and when there have been demonstrations, even like the World Trade Organization demonstrations in Seattle, it was found that the police were sending undercover people to act as anarchists and to break windows. The actual demonstration was peaceful, and yet there were agent provocateurs trying to look like there was violence so the police could come down.
We were lied to about that demonstration. I mean, it was looked at as this incredibly violent demonstration by WTO protesters, World Trade Organization protesters. In fact, it was all a lie. And that lie got perpetrated in newspaper after newspaper, year after year. All kinds of new policing techniques came up. The definition of domestic terrorism grew out of that, which is to say, doing something violent that may endanger human life because of political goals. A definition that could encompass, all kinds of environmental activists, and everybody, a lot of other people, because violent doesn't have a term. It's just a term that means breaking any state law. So sitting down in the street and blocking the street could be considered violence. That's where they got the definition of terrorism from. And then going forward after 9/11, what's happened to protest is, I'm from New York. We had the Republican National Convention there. They arrested hundreds of people preemptively, not because they were doing anything. They threw wide nets over people. They took them to a warehouse on the Hudson River we call Guantanamo on the Hudson. It had oil, slick, environmental junk all over it, and we couldn't get them out of jail for days because the government, the Bloomberg administration, just wanted them off the streets, even though they had done nothing. And that you can repeat, whether it's the RNC, Republican National Convention in Minneapolis, whether it was the G20 in Pittsburgh, with various variations, but essentially trying to ensure that protest cannot be effective.
Well, there's the old thing, we've got to wrap up, but there's the old thing in Nazi Germany. They came for the labor people and I did nothing. And then they came for the Jews and I did nothing. And then they came for me and nobody did anything. So in the minute or so that remains for us, tell us what people can do. The bedrock of our civilization is our right to free speech and our human rights, and they're being eroded. What can just the normal person look out for, and what can we do?
Well, you can start with the shortest, which is, here we just passed the Patriot Act. Again, with all of these bad provisions that allow everything you do, from your bank accounts to everything else, to be spied on by the government. You should get a hold of your congressman and say, that's enough. I mean, I'm an American. I have a right not to have this stuff looked at. I mean, so that's just minimal. That's normal lobbying, writing letters, all of that. The second thing I think people have to do is they have to, like, when you see a few lonely people out there protesting, I would join them. I mean, you just have to exercise a right or you're going to lose it. Despite all of the government repression and surveillance, you just have to exercise your rights or you're going to lose them. So I consider that to be absolutely critical. The final thing, at least from my point of view at the office, is we have right now, we still have a Guantanamo sitting there despite Obama's promises to close it. And we're at a dead end. The litigation isn't going to take us any farther. You can go to look at the Center for Constitutional Rights website, and you can do what you can do to try and get Guantanamo closed. Partly for the people who are innocent who are in there, and partly because, even as our American generals have said, Guantanamo is one of the bigger recruiting aspects for al-Qaeda around the world, the fact that we have that offshore prison camp. And we should also understand the fact that we have it is a message for the future. What we have seen, our reaction to 9/11, which is repression of dissent, offshore prison camps, torture, special trials, preventive detention, all that is stuff that you had not had in 225 years of American history. And we have it today, and unless we protest it, we'll have it tomorrow.
And the other thing that I like to push for is we've got to have civics in the schools again. It got cut with art and PE, and kids need to grow up knowing their rights and knowing our beautiful history in this country and how people have fought for those rights. And so we will continue to do so. And well, I want to thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine.
Our guest today is Michael Ratner. One of his books is The Trial of Donald Rumsfeld. And this one, which I think everyone should have, Hell No, Your Right to Dissent in 21st Century America. So thank you for all you do for all of us and our country.
Lorraine, thank you very much for having me.
And I'm Lorraine Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by a grant from New Mexico Tech on the frontier of science and engineering education for bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. New Mexico Tech is the college you've been looking for. 1-800-428-TECH. And by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.